Thank you, and good afternoon. So this is a festival that is focused on the idea of journeys. And so when I agreed to speak this afternoon, I thought I would talk about the particular journey that I took last fall as a member of the President's NSA review group on foreign intelligence surveillance. And what I'll do is talk a bit about that experience, what it was, and then reserve some time to talk about one or two of the programs in particular that we evaluated. So what was this review group that I'm referring to? So after Edward Snowden revealed masses of information about NSA surveillance programs that had previously been classified, President Obama decided that he needed an independent group who could evaluate the programs and to give him objective advice about how to think about these programs and other programs going forward. And in mid-August a year ago, I was sitting in my office at the University of Chicago Law School, working feverishly on a book that I've been working on for several years on a totally unrelated topic to this. The book is on sex and the Constitution. And I was deeply enmeshed in this and was hoping to finish at least a first draft of this very lengthy manuscript by the time classes began around October 1st. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's a former student of mine, Lisa Monaco, who is the Homeland Security Advisor to the President. And Lisa says to me that President Obama is going to appoint a 5-person review group to evaluate the NSA surveillance programs, which, as she said, you've read about in the newspapers recently. And the President would be most grateful if you'd be willing to serve as a member of this group. And I have to tell you, my initial response was, shit. I really didn't want to do this. I was, as I said, feverishly at work on this book. I was in a groove, and presidential commission reports generally sink beneath the surface, disappear, they make no difference. And even though I was flattered, this was not the way I wanted to spend my time over the next 5 months. And nonetheless, you don't say no to the President of the United States. You don't say no to a former student. And you particularly don't say no to the President of the United States when you were Dean of the law school, hired him to be a member of your faculty. So I took a deep breath and I said to Lisa, sure, I'm happy to do it. Now what? And she says, well, we'll have somebody out there tomorrow to begin the security clearance process, because you're going to have top secret clearance. And I immediately thought, okay, I got an out. I have not led an unblemished life. And my particular ace in the hole was that several months earlier, a very dear friend of mine from college had been diagnosed with cancer. And he's now okay, happily. But I went to visit him, and I remember when I got to the front door of his home, he opened the door, and he was carrying this black box. And he flips it open, and with a big grin on his face, he says, we're going to have a great weekend. I've got spearmint. I've got strawberry. I've got nighttime. I've got morning. I've got afternoon. I've got chocolate. I've got vanilla. Turns out it's a medical marijuana state. And, you know, what am I going to do? Say to my friend who's been diagnosed with cancer, sorry, I can't do that. It's legal for you, but not for me. So we spent the weekend getting stoned. And so when the nice woman comes the next day to my office to begin the security clearance, I eagerly relate this to her, saying, "I'm sorry, but I think it's just not going to work." And she didn't even bat an eye. So, somewhat to my dismay, over the next 2 weeks, I passed the security clearance. To my dismay, partly because I was disappointed that I had not led a blemished enough life to be disqualified. And the next thing I know, I'm on a plane to Washington, D.C., to meet with this group for the first time, and to enter a world that I had had no experience with firsthand at all, and which for the next 5 months I found utterly all-consuming, sometimes bewildering, and always fascinating. And I remember on the plane to D.C. that day thinking, okay, so what am I going to bring to this, right? What's my comparative advantage? And I basically thought, well, first of all, I have two priors as I think about these issues that I've been reading about in the papers. One is I was very struck several years earlier when I read a comment by James Baker, who had been in the Bush administration, about what it was like to be in the White House in the months after 9/11 and to be responsible for protecting the safety of the United States against future terrorist attacks. And the way Baker described it was that it was like being a goalie in a soccer game when the other team could score from any side, including from behind, when the opposing players were invisible and the ball was invisible, and if they scored a goal, 3,000 people would die, and you're the goalie. And the point of that, of course, was you have to have information. You've got to look at every blade of grass and try to understand what movements indicate something about the location of the players and the ball if you're going to save these people's lives. And part of the reason that is such a compelling description is that ordinarily we rely upon deterrence to keep ourselves safe, whether it's the criminal law and the threat of being jailed, or whether it's international law and the threat of retaliation. We naturally rely on deterrence to prevent other people from doing things to us. That's the single most important device that we have in order to keep ourselves safe. And in this realm, in the post-9/11 world, deterrence disappears. It's non-existent. The enemy is not a nation state. There is no one against whom you can retaliate, period. And these individuals are perfectly happy and willing to give up their lives. So the single most important measure we rely upon to protect ourselves is simply gone. And for that reason, the soccer analogy is so powerful. Because the only way you can protect yourself is knowing where that ball is, even though you can't see it. So that's one thing I thought about that day on the plane. And what an awesome and complicated and challenging responsibility it is to try to protect us from these subsequent attacks. The other thing I thought about, though, was that I was clearly put on this group, at least in part because I was the civil libertarian voice among the five. And I'll say in a moment who the other four were. But I was the one who clearly was most visibly identified as the civil libertarian. I am a lifelong member of the ACLU. I'm on the ACLU's National Advisory Council. I served as chair of the board of the American Constitution Society, which is a progressive legal organization. And I've written extensively throughout my career about various civil liberties and civil rights issues. So clearly that's why I was brought into the mix. And in particular, I was very much attuned to the fact that throughout American history, from the Sedition Act of 1798 through the Civil War, through World War I, World War II, the McCarthy era, we have always overreacted to the dangers that we face. We've always taken measures that dramatically restricted civil liberties and civil rights of other individuals in order to keep ourselves safe, and then later regretted the fact that we had overreacted in that way. And that one of the interesting themes about American history in this regard is this constant reevaluation of having gone too far and then later said, I can't believe we did this, and then apologized and so on. And this is evident, for example, in the Japanese American internment during World War II, or the widespread suppression of dissent during World War I, or Lincoln's very aggressive suspensions of the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, or the McCarthy era, and so on. So this is a natural, human nature being what it is, this is natural, this is what you do. And so one of the things I thought I could bring into this process is a sense of that context, of that historical understanding, and say that we need to be particularly careful and rigorous because we are inevitably, we're overreacting. And we know that now, even though we haven't thought it, and we have to figure out how to avoid that overreaction, how to trim things down, how to focus them better. So I thought I could bring that to the table. Okay, so I get to Washington, and I check into the Georgetown Inn, at which I spent almost all of the next 5 months. And I go then immediately to this building on K Street, which was a secure facility, a SCIF. To get into it, you had to have a top-secret clearance, in which our group was to be located. And the group consisted of the 5 of us as members and 9 full-time staff persons who were tasked to assist us from the various intelligence agencies, NSA, CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, and so on, and who, by the way, were great. They were just absolutely terrific. And so we got together in this room, and we met for the first time. So the other 4 individuals were Richard Clarke, who was on the National Security Council in the Clinton and Bush administrations, an expert in cyber warfare, deeply enmeshed in the intelligence community for important parts of his career, very experienced in that world. Mike Morrell, who was acting director of the CIA twice during his long stint at the CIA, and deputy director for an even longer stint. He had just left the CIA, retired from the CIA a few months before, and was not at all happy that President Obama tapped him and said, come on back. But also someone who had lived inside this world, knew it inside and out, and was a deeply enmeshed member of the intelligence community. The third was Peter Swire, professor at Georgia Tech, and Peter had served as the Privacy and Information Technology Officer in the Clinton administration, and then for the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And the fourth, Cass Sunstein, and a former colleague of mine at the University of Chicago Law School for many years, another, like myself, a constitutional law scholar. Cass had gone off to work in the Obama administration in the first term at a high position in the Office of Management and Budget. And so the 5 of us come together for the first time in this secure facility, a set of small, kind of informal, not very well-staffed, I shouldn't say staffed, not well-appointed offices. And we sit down and we introduce ourselves to each other. And the first thing we asked is, okay, we have to write this report. And what are we going to do when we disagree? Because looking around the room, it's obvious we're going to disagree. And so how do you think we should handle this, right? Should we write dissenting reports, or should we indicate with respect to each of our recommendations, however many there are going to be eventually, who agrees and who disagrees? And we talked about that for a couple of minutes, and then the person who was the head of the staff for the group tapped us on the shoulder and said, time to go to the White House. So we never resolved that in that conversation. And so we get in one of these black vans, exactly the kind of black van you see on TV, right? And we drive to the White House, and we go to meet for an hour with the president and National Security Advisor Susan Rice and a number of other high administration officials in the intelligence community and in the Department of Justice to get our charge, basically. And the meeting was in the Situation Room, which also looks just like it does on TV. And the president basically said to us that what I need from you is a report by December 15th. You will have complete access to anything you want. If ever you need our assistance, don't hesitate to ask. What I need from you is not a legal analysis of the legality or constitutionality of these programs. Among other reasons, several of us were not lawyers. What I want from you is to answer the question, assuming these programs are legal, should we do them? Is it good public policy to do them? And if not, what's a better way of structuring them and of achieving the goals that we need to achieve? And I want you to be completely independent, completely objective, and free to say anything that you want. And we said, okay, that sounds like a fair deal, and off we went. So over the course of the next 5 months, I spent every week from Sunday to typically Thursday night in D.C. And when I was back in Chicago on Friday and Saturday, I could not do any work either at home or in my law school office because I was dealing with classified material. So I had another skiff in the FBI headquarters here in Chicago where I would go into my little office where only I had the code, so I could work on the materials when I was in Chicago. So what did we do during these 5 months? So much of what we did was to gather information. And so we met every day with 1, 2, 3, or 4 different organizations or groups holding what amounted to kind of hearings, where we were holding the hearings and gathering information. So we met on multiple occasions with the NSA, with the CIA, with the FBI, with Homeland Security, with the Director of National Intelligence, with the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, with a wide range of members of Congress, both Senate and House, who were either on those committees or on the Judiciary Committees, or others who wanted to have a say with our group. We met with representatives from technology companies, from Facebook, Verizon, Sprint, Google, all of whom had interests in these various programs and how they might affect their business interests. We met on a regular basis with representatives from the European Union who were concerned about these issues, with all of the privacy and civil liberties organizations who wanted to have a say in this process, and so on. So it was this constant information gathering, reviewing information, trying to get a handle on what we did, what we should be doing, how to think about the objections, and so on. I'll tell you a couple, this is about journeys, I'll tell you a couple of my favorite moments in this process. The day after we first met with the president, we had a whole day at Fort Meade, the NSA's headquarters, in which we got briefed by the officials at the NSA, including Director Keith Alexander, about various programs that had been exposed by Edward Snowden, others that we were interested in. And it was a really impressive briefing. They were direct, they were straightforward, they answered questions, they had data, they made as transparent as I could ever have imagined how all of these different programs operated and worked and so on. And they were very smart and basically extremely impressive individuals. The next day, we had a meeting with the FBI that was meant to be a similar type event. And it had a very different feel to it. The FBI officers who were there, first of all, were less senior. And second of all, they kind of did it like a 6th grade show and tell. And it was quite clear that their mindset was, how do we kill the time without telling them anything that we'd rather they not know? And after about an hour, Richard Clarke, who I have come to have great respect and affection and admiration for, Richard gets up and he says, "This is bullshit. We're out of here." Now, nobody authorized Clarke to do that. We didn't have a chair. We decided. And the other 4 of us, all of whom were thinking the same thing, but probably wouldn't have done that, sort of kind of sheepishly got up and walked out. And it was a brilliant thing to do. because nobody ever bullshitted us again. That story spread around Washington very quickly. And it gave us a much greater degree of credibility than we otherwise might have had. So Clark knew exactly what he was doing, even though at the moment I thought he was a jerk. Another moment I'll describe is that we, on several occasions, many occasions actually, we met with the House and Senate Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. And at the outset, these committees are used to having people come in and testify to them, right? But we were not in that mode, right? They wanted to know, what are you thinking? Our mode was, we're fact-finding. What do you know that we should know? And they were completely bewildered by that when it began. And they were not very good at it, I have to say. And in one moment later on, Senator Lindsey Graham on the Judiciary Committee, who I really had thought pretty well of before I got to know him, he says, do you believe that we're at war with radical Islam? And the five of us kind of look at each other, is this guy crazy? And nobody says anything. And he then says, do you believe that we are at war with radical Islam? At which point, Richard Clark, who's sitting at the end, turns his chair away and looks at the opposite direction. And I had told Cass Sunstein, who I've known for many years, who's had a lot of experience testifying before Congress, and I've had some, but not as much. I said, if I get out of line, I want you to kick me, right? So at this point, we're all sort of just sitting there, looking at this guy like he's a madman. And I said, Senator, I don't think your question makes any sense. At which point, Cass kicks me so hard in the leg. And finally, Mike Morrell, the CIA guy, basically says, well, Senator, if you mean, do we think that there are international conflicts that require complex foreign intelligence work? Yes, we do. And then we moved on. But that was one of the less high moments of the experience. Okay, so in the end, we produced this 300-page report with 46 recommendations, reviewing many different previously classified programs. And we decided to write this report not as a classified document, because we felt the issues we were discussing were important ones for the general population to be able to understand. So we wrote this report specifically not classified and for a general audience. And I encourage you, actually, to read it. So it's available either online, or you can go to Amazon. Princeton University Press published it. And if you're interested in it, you just go to Amazon and type in the NSA report, and you can get that. I get no royalty, just to be clear. It's a government document, so I'm not shilling for myself here. But it was written for you guys. And it goes through the history of the programs, what they are, how they operate, and what our 46 recommendations were. Now, on the recommendations, as I said to you, the first day we met, we talked about what are we going to do when we disagree? Because obviously the five of us are very different perspectives, very different histories and backgrounds and so on. We're going to disagree. And it turned out all 46 recommendations were unanimous. And they were genuinely unanimous. It wasn't, oh, okay, I'll give you this one if you give me that one. What was so interesting about this experience, it was so intense, it was so much like being in a cave or a foxhole together. And we talked everything through 16 hours a day, 5 days a week, that by the end, we actually came to have this kind of Vulcan mind meld with each other, in which we understood each other's perspectives, put them together, and managed to find common ground, and at the same time, make some very strong and definitive recommendations. So that was just a remarkable part of this whole process. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about substance now. So I think I'll focus in particular on Section 215 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is the program that came to be known as the telephone metadata program, which is the one that's gotten the most attention among American audiences. So here's a little background of what that program is, how it came about, and it's kind of representative of the way we went about our business as a group. Until the late 1970s, foreign intelligence surveillance was thought to be entirely a matter for the autonomous discretion of the president. That is, if the president was seeking information about foreign intelligence, about terrorists, about spies, about what other nations were doing, he could do this under his own authority as commander-in-chief, whether inside the United States or outside the United States, without any interference from either Congress or the judiciary. So if the president wanted to wiretap in the United States someone suspected of being a spy or a terrorist, he could do that, did not have to go to a judge, did not have to get a warrant, did not have to show probable cause. This was just part of the unlimited discretion of the executive branch to keep the nation safe. In the 1970s, during the Vietnam period, it came to light that the FBI, the CIA, Army Intelligence, the NSA, all had, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, and Lyndon Johnson, vastly abused their authorities in engaging in widespread surveillance against Americans having nothing to do with foreign intelligence and having to do with their political opposition to the Vietnam War. And when all of this came to light, Congress decided to investigate the matter, appointed the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church of Ohio, which wrote a really magnificent report analyzing the abuses, and ultimately enacted the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. And what that act did was to bring foreign intelligence surveillance within the domain of law for the first time in American history. And it provided, among many other things, that insofar as the government wants to investigate foreign intelligence surveillance inside the United States, it had to go to a court to get either a warrant or a court order in order to engage in various types of surveillance activities inside the United States. And there was immediately a problem with that idea because there were no courts who could do that, because everything that these agencies were doing in the realm of foreign intelligence was classified. Ordinary judges do not have security clearances. And so you can't go to them and ask for a warrant to wiretap a suspected terrorist or a suspected spy if you have to reveal to them classified information, which is the basis on which you have probable cause, because they're not allowed to know the information. Right? So the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created something called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And that court consists of regular federal judges who have gone through the clearance process and who sit on a rotating basis. They go to Washington for 2 weeks at a time on a rotating basis, in which they basically listen to the requests of the various agencies for judicial orders or judicial warrants authorizing them to engage in various types of surveillance and information gathering in the realm of foreign intelligence. Okay, Section 215 is a provision of the 1978 Act that authorizes the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to issue orders that authorize agencies like the NSA to gather information about people who are suspected, among other things, of being potential terrorists in the United States. And the way Section 215 operates is kind of the way subpoenas operate in the ordinary criminal process. So in the ordinary criminal process, if a prosecutor suspects somebody of being engaged in criminal conduct, the prosecutor could issue a subpoena that will order, say, that person's phone company to turn over the phone records of that individual, or their bank turn over their financial records, or a car rental agency to turn over the car rental arrangements made by that individual. And it can do that as long as the government can show that there's reasonable grounds to believe that the information might be relevant to a criminal investigation. A much lower standard than an ordinary search warrant, which involves things like wiretaps or going into somebody's home and going through their private possessions and so on. So Section 215 authorizes the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to issue similar orders, except classified, to the various agencies. Okay, so what that means in simple form is, let's suppose the NSA has reason to believe that X is in the United States, whether an American citizen or somebody else, is a terrorist. They could go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and get a search warrant showing probable cause to wiretap that person's phone calls. If they don't have probable cause and they only have this much lower standard called reasonable suspicion, they could still obtain their phone records from their phone company to see whether they're talking to other people who are also suspected of terrorism. Okay, none of that's actually controversial. That's just background. Okay, several years ago, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court approved the telephone metadata program. So what did that mean? So metadata is simply the word that's used for your phone records that indicate every number you call and the number of any person who calls you. It does not indicate anything about the content of the phone calls, nor does it directly indicate anything about the identities of the people to whom you're calling, although the numbers are there. But it's just basically what you'd see on a phone bill. And what the NSA said is, what we want to do is we want to get all of the information about phone calls of masses of people in the United States and put it in a database. And then we want to be able to query the database when we have reason to believe that a particular phone number is being used by a terrorist. So what it basically meant is that the NSA would be authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to sweep in hundreds of millions of records indiscriminately of, let's say, most of you, indiscriminately, most of you, and put it into this huge database. The NSA would not be allowed to access anything in the database unless it had reasonable grounds to believe that a particular person outside the United States was a terrorist. And if they knew that someone outside the United States was reasonably suspected of being a terrorist and they had that person's phone number, they could then basically type into the database the phone number of this suspected terrorist in Pakistan to see whether that person was in touch with anyone in the United States. And what they were looking for is whether that person in, say, Pakistan was in touch with anyone in the United States who was independently reasonably suspected of being a terrorist already. So they're looking to connect the dots, to use that cliche, right? And what they were interested in is two things. First was the person in Pakistan talking to someone who is a suspected terrorist in the United States directly. Second thing they were interested in was the person in Pakistan speaking to someone in the United States about whom they know nothing, the NSA knows nothing, who is in turn talking to someone who is suspected of being a terrorist, right? So X talks to Y, talks to Z. Y we know nothing about, but X is a suspected terrorist and Z is a suspected terrorist. And whenever the NSA queried the database for this information and got a hit, that is, whenever it had the number from outside the United States talking directly or indirectly to a person already independently suspected of being a terrorist, it would turn the information over to the FBI for further investigation, right? So that's how the metadata program operated. And in 2012, the last year for which we had full data, the NSA queried the database for 288 numbers, phone numbers, of people outside the United States who were suspected of being terrorists. They got 16 hits out of that 288 queries. That is, in 16 instances, the person outside the United States was speaking to someone either directly or one hop away, one step away, who was independently a suspected terrorist, and they turned those 16 cases over to the FBI for further investigation. In none of those cases did the FBI determine that there was, in fact, any terrorist plot that needed to be dealt with. So that's how the Section 215 metadata program basically operates. And the question is, should that be okay? Should the government be allowed to do that? The great danger of that is that the government is in possession of this massive information, which, if abused, can reveal extraordinary amounts of detail about what any individual does. You know, who you call over the course of 5 years could be a psychiatrist, or it could reveal that you're gay, it could reveal you're having an affair, could be revealed you're doing all sorts of things that are embarrassing to you or worse. And the concern is, in the hands of the wrong people, this database is a potential nightmare. And the wrong people, well, you think about J. Edgar Hoover or Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon with the wrong motivations, and they've got in their possession this extraordinary amount of private information about American citizens. And so our recommendation, among others, was that the government should not be allowed to hold this data. That basically the data should remain in the phone companies, which already hold the data independently, and the government should not be able to itself have any access to the information without a court order, which was not previously required, without a court order at each instance that determines that there is a reasonable basis for the government to believe that there's a terrorist making a phone call, and all of this has to be monitored by a court rather than only by the NSA itself. So that's just one example of many I could offer of the kind of limitations that we recommended, basically saying that the goal of the program makes sense, but it has to be done in a way that is more careful, more respectful of the dangers of allowing the program to exist. Let me just conclude with a couple of observations about different entities I dealt with. First of all is the NSA. I came into this on that plane flight going to Washington the first day. I came into this thinking, okay, the problem is the NSA has run amok. Right? The problem is the NSA. What I can say, after having been inside this world, to my great surprise, is the NSA is an organization of great integrity. They do not, in fact, knowingly violate the law, and they are very careful about trying to stay within the boundaries of the authorities that they've been given. To the extent the NSA's programs are problematic, and many of them are, in a variety of ways, like the one I just gave as an example, the problem is that they've been authorized to do these things by the president, by the Congress, and by the judiciary. And if there is responsibility for not having adequate care in designing these programs and monitoring these programs, it fundamentally belongs not to the NSA, but to the Congress, to the executive, and to the judiciary. But I came actually to have great respect for the people in the NSA and their professionalism and their desire to do what they were authorized to do and not more than that. Second observation I give is that the oversight mechanisms that exist are extraordinarily rigorous. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court oversees the operations of NSC programs. The Department of Justice does. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees do. There are inspectors general that do. To the extent a concern is that the NSA is violating its authorities, there's lots of people watching that and generally watching it pretty well. The bigger problem is the absence of oversight in the form of people like our group who are able to come in independently and make this evaluation of, should you be doing this program in the first place? Right? Not are you complying with the terms of the program, but should you be doing it? And that perspective, I think, was completely lacking in this process. And that seems to be the greatest omission that needs to be addressed. And a final point I'll make is about Congress. In my view, that Senate and House Intelligence Committees were not good at doing their jobs. Partly this is because they simply do not have the staff with the degree of expertise that will enable them to really deeply understand what they're supposed to be overseeing. If we did not have in our group Richard Clarke and Michael Morell, we would have been lost. This is such a complex world. Unless we had two people who were really professionals in that world who knew it cold, it would be impossible to oversee it in any meaningful way. And the Senate and House committees don't have that. They do not have staff who enable them to do that in an effective manner. It's a big problem. And the second part of the problem is that they're too busy raising money to do anything. Quite frankly, the amount of time that they're able to seriously devote to understanding these very complex problems is much too limited. And as a consequence, they just are not able to do the oversight function that they should be able to do. And I learned this very dramatically early on. The Aspen Institute asked me to do an event. They do these every week or every 2 weeks with about 40 members of Congress. And it was a long table in the Congress, and I was sitting at the head of the table, and there were 40 congressmen and senators there. And I talked for 15 or so minutes and then opened the floor for questions. And I made the comment in response to one question that I was impressed by the oversight that I discovered, including, I said, by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. I didn't yet understand how inept they were. And at that point, 3 men who were at the table, all at the same time, went like this. And I said, excuse me, well, time out. What's that? And they all said, I either am serving or I have served on the House Intelligence, they were all in the House Intelligence Committee. We can't do the job. We just don't have the resources to do it, the time to do it. We're not effective. And if we're supposed to be one of the checking mechanisms, that's not going to be very effective. Okay, I'm going to stop then and open the floor for questions. You've got to use mics, so raise your hands. And down here. Thank you.
I have a question right here.
So years ago, I think it was around the time of the Church Committee, James Angleton said that it is inconceivable that a secret intelligence arm of the government has to comply with all the overt orders of the government.
With all the what?
With all the overt orders of the government. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, and if not, what do you make about the testimony to Congress that you just said wasn't doing its job when they were getting information that was not true from Clapper, Hayden, and others?
So there is a real problem in how do you oversee programs that are secret, right? Because the very fact that they're secret means it's very hard for the American people to know, by definition, what they're doing, because they wouldn't be secret if we all knew what they were doing. And so one question is, do you need secrecy, right? And that really varies very much on the nature of a program. So take the metadata program, the telephone metadata program. Why does it need to be secret, right? Why did it matter that Snowden revealed it? Okay, so here's the answer to that, right? The program only works if the terrorist in Pakistan doesn't know you're listening, you're looking at the phone numbers, right? If they don't know that, they may actually call another terrorist in the United States, and then you can track it, right? If they know you're doing this, then all they have to do is go to the local Walgreens or whatever it is there and buy a burner phone. And they use the phone for a short time and throw it out, and there's no way you can now do this, right? So it would be very interesting to know, as I said, there were 288 phone numbers that were queried in the year 2012. It'd be very interesting to know in the year 2014 how many phone numbers are picked up by the metadata program, given the fact that now everyone around the world knows it exists. And I have no idea what the answer to that is because I no longer have top secret clearance. But my guess is that number is going to go way down. And there are lots of other programs that are similar. So there is a trade-off between the ability of the program to function and secrecy. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that the ability of the program to function is worth the secrecy if it turns out that the American people, for example, if they understood everything, would not want us to do the program, right? So you've got to rely in that context on somebody to make a decision about whether secrecy is warranted. And we made a series of recommendations about being much more careful about what is kept secret and what's not kept secret. So that's one of the dilemmas that exists here, is that one of the reasons you need such oversight is because these are secret programs. Now, on the question of the latter part of the question was about lying to the House and Senate committees. The particular instance that has gotten the most attention is this instance when Senator Wyden from Utah, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and knows about these programs, asked Clapper, who is the director of national intelligence, in an open session, not a closed session, an open session where reporters are sitting there and cameras are on and TVs are running, right? Says to him, is it true, this is before Snowden, says to him, is it true that the government is gathering the phone records of millions of Americans? And Clapper's initial response was no, which was a lie. And the question is, well, how do you think about that? So my view about that, frankly, is that Wyden did a terrible thing. Wyden knew about the existence of this program as a member of a classified Senate committee. And the last thing you're supposed to do is to ask a question in a public session where an honest answer would reveal the existence of the classified program. And, what should Clapper have done in that situation? Well, a lot of people say, well, he should have finessed it. He says, well, we should talk about that in closed session. But any answer like that is a yes. Right? So I actually think that in that most dramatic example, that Senator Wyden, who I generally agree with on most of these issues, I thought he misbehaved. I mean, if he wanted to reveal the existence of the program, then do it and take the consequences. But I don't think that putting Clapper in that position was an appropriate thing to do on the part of Senator Wyden. Yep.
Oh, sure. Thank you, by the way, for your account. It was really interesting. One thing that struck me, and I wondered if you could talk about, is what the process was like of you all had security clearances and looked at all this secret stuff, but then you wrote a report that was unclassified. And what was involved in that process? Was that difficult, or?
Well, it was less difficult than it would have been thanks to Edward Snowden. So we could never have written that report but for the fact that the classified information had been made public. It would have been impossible to write that report. But given the fact that the existence of the programs had been made public, it was possible then to talk about them and evaluate them in an open session. Our report did have to go through a declassification process before it could be made public, but we were pretty good about not raising that problem. I think there were maybe 3 or 4 facts that we revealed that we inadvertently were revealing something that they found classified. But fundamentally, it was not a problem. And my own view is, if you read the report, there's nothing that I'm aware of that, if you knew it, would call into question what's being said in the reports. If that were the case, we wouldn't have written anything about the issue. So there were things we'd learned about that we couldn't talk about because they hadn't been revealed, and we just didn't write anything about those.
I have another question right here.
You mentioned at the beginning of your report that one of the reasons you were hesitant to be on the committee was that these reports just never go anywhere. What's happened with your report?
Thank you. Good question. Great question. To my great surprise, this report and this group became very central to the deliberations that have gone on ever since in Washington. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that all of the various constituencies I mentioned and ran through at the outset began to get nervous that because we had the president's ear and because we were meeting constantly with Congress, that we actually would have an impact. And the more people got nervous that we might have an impact, the more impact we actually wound up having. And so in the end, when the president, so what happened is we turned in a report to the president on December 15th. He then reviewed it with members of Congress, with the chiefs of the various agencies and so on, made up his own mind about how he was going to respond. He gave a speech on January 15th of 2014 in which he adopted, I guess I'd say, most of our most important recommendations, rejected one of them that was not surprising but disappointing, didn't address a bunch of the others, which were more complicated. There is a bill pending in Congress which seems to have substantial majority report at the moment from both parties that adopts the vast majority of our most important recommendations. But given Congress, even though a majority of both parties support it, who knows if it's ever going to get enacted. But thus far, I would say that I am completely delighted by the impact that the report had. It completely shaped the debate in Washington and led to the drafting of legislation and to the implementation already of some reforms by the president that he could implement that were in conformity with the recommendations. And people were very surprised by the report, I have to say, because the immediate response was extremely skeptical. It was, these guys are just going to tell the president he can do whatever he wants. Morell and Clark are from inside the security, the national security community. Peter Swire has worked for the Obama administration. Cass Sunstein worked for the Obama administration. Geoff Stone hired Obama. These guys are just going to say, do whatever you want, Mr. President. And the report was much more demanding and critical. And for that reason, too, I think it got a lot of credibility that it wouldn't otherwise have had, because almost everybody was surprised at how tough it was.
We have one over here.
I was just curious as to whether as you mentioned in the beginning, whether the FBI ever came back and un-BS'd themselves.
Yes, after that first instance, the FBI chief, by the way, Jim Comey, is also a former student of mine, and so they did clamor to meet with us again, and we played hard to get for a while just to punish them, and we did eventually have a session with them, and it was much better than the first one, and they did a much better job at being transparent and helping us understand some of their programs. Yeah, they did.
I have another question right here.
You know, having just read through Greenwald's book, who actually debriefed Snowden at length, and if you look at the entire breadth of what the NSA was doing, the biggest concern comes out to be what effect does it have on people's behavior when they know that there is so much that the government is watching, and even if these programs will catch somebody, our biggest concern still remains about the chilling effect it has on personal speech. And this has been written about by, Justice Brandeis in his, first paper on privacy. And that is our biggest concern. I know you mentioned that, they only are collecting not what the phone conversation is, but if they can actually track, like the 8 phone calls you made, you don't really have to know, what was in the phone call itself.
Okay,
if they know what sites they go to,
So the question is, how concerned should we be about the chilling effect on people's behavior of the existence of these programs? So the first answer you might get is, well, there wouldn't be any chilling effect if it wasn't for Edward Snowden, because people didn't know about the programs. And the chilling effect comes about only because they're revealed. So the idea is you can kind of have it both ways, right? Nobody gets chilled, and you get to keep the nation safe, as long as you can keep it secret, right? If the program is not secret, then you have the concern of people will change their behavior. So let me ask you, okay, let's do a survey, okay? How many of you behave differently in your phone calls because you know about the existence of the telephone metadata program? Okay, well, maybe not. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just curious, right? So I think the answer is you have to worry a lot about chilling effect, about the fact that if people know that certain things that they do are going to be known to others, especially the government, but others even beyond the government, that they will change their behavior, and that is a concern. And that concern underlies a lot of both Fourth Amendment doctrine and free speech doctrine in particular. And that's exactly part of what you have to worry about. One of the reasons you want to protect privacy is because you don't want people to change their behavior from the ordinary expected ways in which you want in a free society individuals to be able to act unnecessarily and without a very compelling justification for doing so. And so one of the questions about one of the reasons we made our recommendation about the metadata program, that the government won't have access to the data, and it's held in private hands, and they need a court order, was to reduce the fear that people might have that the government was going to be able to abuse the information. Much greater risk of abuse if the government has it right in front of them, and the head of the NSA, or the head of the CIA, or the head of the FBI has the ability, the power, effectively, to go into that database on his own to get the information, than if you put safeguards in place. At the same time, we do recognize that the government has legitimate and compelling reasons to do things that will also chill behavior. phone calls can be wiretapped if the government has probable cause to believe that a person is guilty of a crime or maybe planning a crime. Now, that doesn't mean the person is guilty of the crime or is planning a crime. And people they talk to who aren't guilty of anything are going to have their phone calls overheard. So chilling effect is built into everything. The question is, when is it reasonable and appropriate, and when is it out of balance? And that's exactly the question. That's exactly the question that our review group was looking at, is to what extent do these programs cause more damage to individual privacy than can be justified by the results that they produce in terms of keeping the nation safe. And that's exactly the question. And that's exactly the question we tried to focus on in the report.
We have time for just one more.
I would like to know, since you have explained all this so clearly, and one of the great things that Snowden did was to release this information about telephone calls, but what is to prevent another insider in the NSA or any one of these agencies from revealing more secrets?
So obviously one of the concerns of the government is that to the extent it is the case that secrecy is necessary to the effective operation of a program that is justified and that is effective, that someone will reveal the existence of those programs and make them ineffective. And this is a real challenge because the fact is there are a couple of million people who are either employees or private contractors, most of them private contractors like Snowden, who have access to classified information. And keeping several million people from not doing this is pretty hard, right? If they do and they're caught, it's a serious crime and they'll go to jail for many years, right? And deterrence is what you try to do. You try to screen people in advance. You try to monitor people in advance. And indeed, a number of our recommendations in the report dealt with this particular problem. And what are the ways in which, consistent with civil liberties, we can try to do a better job at preserving secrecy when secrecy should be preserved. There's also the other question, though, which you didn't quite ask, but which I'll comment on, is did Snowden do us a favor or not? Right? And I've thought, obviously, a lot about this. And I would separate the answer into two parts. The first one is the metadata program. That's the only program that he disclosed that has gotten significant attention in the United States, where there is a substantial probability of reform of the program. And I could easily, and it's also the case that the telephone metadata program has not proved all that effective. And indeed, the NSA had an email program that was similar, and it abandoned it voluntarily because it decided it wasn't all that valuable. And my guess is they would have gotten rid of the telephone metadata program anyway, because they were, I think, coming around to the view that, like the email metadata program, it wasn't worth the cost. But they hadn't quite gotten there yet. So my basic view is that the program was not that valuable, and it needed to be reformed. It was not structured properly, and therefore we will have a better system with respect to that program because Snowden revealed it than we might have had if Snowden had not revealed it. On the other hand, there is still this question of, do you ever want a mid to low level person with access to classified information to think it's okay for him to decide, I think this is a bad program. I think, you know, even though the Congress has approved it, even though the President has approved it, even though the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court has approved it, I think we should get rid of it. So I'm going to blow the whistle on the program. You know, can you really operate a national security system in a world in which individuals think that it's okay for them individually to make that decision? So one might argue that even if Snowden did us a favor by disclosing the metadata program, he still shouldn't be allowed to do it. Because for every Snowden, there's other people who would do it and it would be wrong. Now, the second part of it, however, is much larger. 95% of what Snowden revealed was involved foreign intelligence surveillance. That is, surveillance programs not directed in any way at American citizens, but directed at individuals outside the United States who were not U.S. citizens. And those programs, unlike the metadata program, have been extremely successful at enabling the United States and other nations around the world to thwart planned terrorist attacks. And the disclosure of those programs has led to no serious reconsideration in the United States about those programs. No one seems upset about them. No one in Congress seems inclined to want to change them. But the disclosure of the programs has undermined their effectiveness in important ways. And on that score, I think it's impossible to say with a straight face that Snowden revealing that part of what he disclosed did us a favor. I think the fact is that general assessment, when all is said and done, is those programs are basically strong programs. We need to have them. Yes, they can be refined in relatively minor ways, but the disclosure of those programs probably did the nation a real harm and not much of a service, because we're not changing any of them. So there, I think probably it's hard to make the case that Snowden did us a favor. I think with that, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.